On today's episode of This Week in Space, I talked to Mike Wall of Space.com about the one and only Starship. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 58, recorded on April 21st, 2023. Starship Ahoy! This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by Bitwarden. Get the password manager that offers a robust and cost-effective solution that drastically increases your chances of staying safe online. You can get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or get started for free across all devices as an individual user at bitwarden.com/twit. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Rapid Unscheduled Disassembly Edition. I'm Rod Pyle, Editor-in-Chief at Ad Astra Magazine. I'm joined by Mike Wall, ace reporter for Space.com. His actual title is Senior Space Writer. Actually, no, that's not true. You're editor of, say it again?
Space Flight and Tech, I guess. Yeah.
Channel? Okay. But I kind of like the Jimmy Olsen vibe of ace. So how are you, Mike?
I'm doing good. It's been an eventful week, that's for sure.
I think the last time I saw you was at JPL for Curiosity, was it? No, Perseverance.
Yeah, I think it was for Perseverance. I was also out there for Insight, and I think I probably saw you there too. All these missions, all these trips kind of run together a little bit.
Yeah, but a visit to JPL is always a good thing, and we don't have to wait for tour tickets.
Yeah.
And just in case people are wondering, our good friend Tarek Malik is in transit back from Boca Chica, where he watched the launch of Starship, the test flight, and we will have some video from him later, hearing him giggle insanely while he watches go up. But before we do that, we have a new space joke from loyal listener Izzy Welch, who is 12. Are you ready, Mike?
I am.
What do you call a tick on the moon?
A tick on the moon? A lunar tick?
A lunatic. Very good.
All right.
Kudos to you and Izzy. Thank you for that joke. As always, we invite you to Padoom! We invite you to join Team Tarek and send us your best or worst space joke. We take them all. Don't forget to do us a solid also and make sure to like, subscribe, and all those other podcast things, because we're your best friends.
Oh yeah, Tarek is the champ of the dad space joke. I mean, on our internal Slack channel, you guys would be amazed at some of the stuff he puts out there.
Why doesn't he send them to me?
I don't know. I'll have to let him know.
Because I think I've plumbed the depths of the best or worst space jokes out there. All right, let's get on to some headlines. And you're up on base since Tarek isn't here. First one, Ingenuity makes his 50th flight. This is the small Mars helicopter that went up the Perseverance rover. And, you know, it's worth saying this was a last minute, not very thoroughly budgeted project. It's still, I don't know, $80 million, I think.
Yeah, I think it's 80 million.
But they had 18 months to put it together because there was some foot dragging going on about making a decision. And, you know, they wanted to fly a couple of times just to see if they could. And now, Flight 50, tell us about it.
Yeah, no, I can't really get enough of Ingenuity. I mean, it's just so amazing that we're doing this, you know, and yeah, I mean, as you're saying, it's a technology demonstrator. You know, Mars's atmosphere is extremely thin, and we didn't really know if we could do real aerial exploration there, just based on that, because, you know, it's very, very different than here on Earth, where we have a very, very thick atmosphere. So yeah, sending this thing to Mars, and they wanted it to fly about 5 times. They sent it with Perseverance, landed a few years ago, and yeah, it just keeps on going. It's flown 50 times now. It's 10 times over what it was originally budgeted for, or they originally wanted it to do. And it's not only that, but they've actually shifted it into a new mission. It's not just tech demo now. It's actually serving as a scout for Perseverance. It's like helping it pick the best routes to get to the next science destination and all that stuff. And also, we also know NASA wants to kind of ramp up its aerial exploration of Mars, and they plan to get more ambitious helicopters going on future missions. And so they're kind of pushing Ingenuity's limits to see what those future helicopters might be able to do too. So I just think we are flying a little helicopter on another planet. It just gets to me. I just love writing about it. And we just saw a picture that was taken of Ingenuity on Mars by Perseverance, came up really close to it, about like 75 feet away, and you see how dusty it is, but it's still in good shape and it's still doing its thing. So I think it's just worth highlighting every once in a while that we have this little thing flying on Mars. It's really, really cool.
Well, and thanks to our good friend John at TWiT, who is a self-confessed space enthusiast, for reminding us that there was a picture of the dusty Mars helicopter just before we started this episode.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing. And hats off to the Ingenuity team and Mimi Ong, who is no longer with JPL. I think she went on to work at Amazon on Project Kuiper or something, but she really, this was pushing a big rock up a very steep hill to get this thing flown, and very impressive they got it done. All right, next up, satellite refueling. So our good friends at Space Force, cue the theme music, not really, are getting serious about refueling some of their older but very functional satellites. When you launch a military satellite, generally they go up to geosynchronous orbit, which is about 25,000 miles, and that's the spot where the satellite's orbit is at the same rate as the Earth's rotation, so you can stare at one side of the Earth permanently. These are big, they're the small ones are probably the size of cargo vans, and the big ones can be much larger. And when they run out of gas, that's a bad thing because they can't maneuver anymore. Some of them have gyroscopes in them, but you still need fuel to reposition and so forth. So for decades, there's been discussions about refueling in orbit, a little bit of testing, but there's something hard to test because you have to be at 0G, and fluids kind of do their own thing at 0G. They behave more like wild animals than something we understand down here in a 1G environment. And it sounds easy. It sounds like you just take a big hypodermic up there and squeeze the gas into the satellite, but you have to rendezvous, you have to dock, you have to make sure you've got a secure fitting. Some of these fuels are caustic, and you got to make sure that you don't have leakage. So it's a tough thing. So what's different about this effort, Mike?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's different, I think, is that we're seeing like a real push from a major player in space, which is our like U.S. Space Force. And I mean, this is technology, as you've been saying. People have been wanting to do this for a long time. There've been a few demonstrator missions. NASA did one a few years back. There are various private companies looking to do this too, because they see that there's real margin here for them. Some of these really big satellites, this is interesting because there's a push in the space industry to do smaller, cheaper, faster. It's very cheap to launch now compared to 10, 15 years ago. And with the electronics revolution ongoing, you can pack way more efficiency and way more power into smaller packages. So you can have smaller mass, which is cheaper to launch. Look at what some of these satellite firms are doing. Planet, based here in San Francisco, has these little CubeSats the size of a loaf of bread. They've got about 200 of them up there taking photos of Earth all over the place. And so it's like you're not going to refuel those sorts of things because they're cheap to make and you can just launch more of them. But for these legacy older things, these big military satellites, they are huge and they are up high. And if they die up there, that's a space junk issue too, because they stay up there for decades and decades, and they become a bullet waiting to hit something. So this has applications, for the military, for satellite operators who want to keep their very valuable assets going, but also for the rest of us who care about the sustainable use of space, keep these assets alive longer. And maybe even, if it becomes cheap enough in the future, you could even do this with satellites that are dead or about to die and just go put a little bit of fuel in them to bring them down, so they don't become space junk, And also, as you look out farther, going to the moon or to Mars, doing off-Earth refueling is going to be really key to that effort, to the sustainable exploration of the solar system. So some of these things that we learn how to do in Earth orbit, you can see them being applied for more ambitious stuff down the road too.
Yeah, and SpaceX is going to be having to look at this very seriously in the next couple of years as well, because they want to do orbital refueling, and that's on a scale.
It's a huge part of Starship. Yeah. They're going to need to do that with Starship in a massive scale. So that's actually that might be what drives this forward. SpaceX has a history of driving things forward in the space business, and so what they end up doing with Starship may be the kind of leader in this industry in just a few years from now. We shall see.
All right. Well, that story came to us from spacenews.com, and Ingenuity and the next one come from our good friends at space.com. Jackals in space. Space startup True Anomaly, what a name, plans to test fly 2 Inspector satellites in October of this year. The company was started in 2022, already has about $30 million in funding. I think because they have an idea that besides being kind of cool and cutting edge, is something that the United States government Space Force are very interested in, which is enhancing what's called space domain awareness, which is basically matching Russian and Chinese efforts to track your adversary's satellites and identify the capabilities. So for this test, they'll launch 2 satellites that will track and approach each other instead of foreign objects. And part of this push is in response to what we've been seeing China and Russia do. I'm not sure it's fair to call them our adversaries yet, but there's that fear that that will be coming in the future. And of course, all militaries, modern militaries, rely heavily on satellites, but especially the U.S., to give you awareness of the battlefield and what's going on and where things are positioned and who's coming and who's going and that stuff. And of course, as we've seen with what's going on in Ukraine, orbital reconnaissance has been a really critical part of that. So the plan of True Anomaly, at least what they've announced so far, are to build thousands of these with autonomous capability, and they just scoot around up there investigating things. And I think part of what kicked this off also was we've seen in the last couple of years, the Russians, I don't remember what the Chinese did. I know the Russians maneuvered something spookily close to the space station at one point.
Yeah,
there's been some satellite intercepts as well, right?
Yeah, there have been a few like inspector sats. We've seen like the U.S. Space Force officials have come out on a couple of different occasions and like basically said, they're Russian satellites that seem to be like inspecting some of our assets up in orbit, and it's irresponsible. They aren't telling us about this. They aren't warning us. So this sort of stuff is already happening. I mean, you like talk about how important it is to have really powerful satellites up there. That's one of the thing that it's one of the main reasons basically that the U.S. has been like the globally dominant military power since the dawn of the space age, basically, is because our space assets are so good. And there's all of this worry in U.S. military circles about our sort of edge being degraded and being at serious risk from, principally China. China is extremely ambitious and is getting better and better and launching more and more things. But this all kind of ties together. This new company, True Anomaly, is kind of tied in with the U.S. military. I think it has like a lot of overlap in its personnel and basically in its mission capabilities, and what they aim to do is very in keeping with what the U.S. military wants to do. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do end up doing, because this does open up like a lot of issues. How close can you get to another country's satellite without it being very provocative? Do you have to warn them that you're doing this? What kind of incident do you want to avoid? What kind of inspection could lead to an international incident? Like all these things are already out there, because as we've seen with the Russian inspector sats, but it's only going to become more of an issue as we go forward and more of these things start going up. So yeah, it'll be really interesting. I think these 2 are going to go up on a Falcon 9, a SpaceX rocket, like this fall. It'll be really interesting to see what they do and to see where they go after that.
Well, just for some historical context, this is an old discussion that's been renewed with AI and non-crewed spacecraft, but boy, as early as the late 50s, early 60s, there was discussions, at least in the United States, and I believe the Soviet Union as well, about crewed reconnaissance vehicles. So there was a program called Blue Gemini that was going to have a number of Gemini flights in the 60s flown by Air Force pilots, and they talked about doing intercepts and inspections. Dinosaur, the X-20, which was a space plane that didn't fly, but it was going to be the first space plane, which is another Air Force project, was also going to be queued up to be able to do that. And I think the most interesting one to me, although it's not clear how far they went with it, but at one point Grumman Aerospace was looking at the lunar module, a legless lunar module, as a satellite intercept and inspector. And there were rumors, at any rate, that one of its primary weapon systems, if you will, would be basically to have a manipulator arm and a can of spray paint, and you could just get up next to a bad guy's satellite and spray over their camera lenses. That's kind of a delightfully simplistic way of doing things, but it's direct, and I guess spray paint will work in space. They never tried it. Like fortunately, we didn't do those things.
Yeah, no, it's a delightful mix of the high tech and the extremely low tech. Yeah, and
graffiti in space, right?
Right, and yeah, I mean, those are inspection things. I mean, as far as kind of just putting people up in space to do spying there. Yeah, there was also like the manned orbiting laboratory,
Right.
which the Air Force was talking about doing, which basically would have been a spying space station that like never got off the ground either. But yeah, there are all these. There have been thoughts about doing stuff like this for a super long time. So it's interesting to see that it's actually happening now.
I remember as a kid, because I'm older than you by quite a bit, building a model of the manned orbiting laboratory. And I was fascinated to realize that about, I think, probably 70% of it was that orbiting telescope that was going to be built by Eastman Kodak, I think.
Yeah.
And there was this very small crew volume where these guys were basically going to camp out with a couple of hammocks and a hot plate, and spend a month at a time up there just operating this enormous camera. But then robotic satellites got good enough that they could do that. But interestingly, at least until the 70s, as I recall, still had to send the images back by deorbiting film canisters. I will add one more bit of trivia that is kind of neither here nor there, but there was one Russian Salyut mission, also known as Almaz in their military parlance, which was their earliest single module space stations, that carried a defensive system in case they were intercepted by the Amerikanskis. They installed a Richter anti-aircraft gun on one end of the Soyuz and actually did a test firing of it in orbit just to see if it would work. I think it was 30 millimeter slugs. But because they were afraid of what would happen to the station with this tremendous amount of concussion, they waited until the cosmonauts departed and then fired it by remote control, and it kind of rattled the thing around, but it didn't hurt anything. And I don't know if those slugs ever came down or not. They may still be in orbit. I think they fired 30 rounds.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Like think about what the recoil would do. You're going to need to kind of counteract that with your thrusters, right?
Right, or just go into an orbit, right?
Yeah.
Find yourself slinging by the moon any moment. All right, we're going to come back to talk about our favorite topic, Starship, in just a minute after this moment for Bitwarden. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by Bitwarden. Bitwarden is the only open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, at work, or on the go, and is trusted by millions. Even our very own Steve Gibson has switched over. With Bitwarden, all the data in your vault is end-to-end encrypted, not just your passwords. Protect your data privacy with Bitwarden by adding security to your passwords with strong randomly generated passwords for each account. You can go further with the username generator and create unique usernames for each account, or even use any of the 5 integrated email alias services. Bitwarden has new features to announce for the latest release, including there will now be an alert when Bitwarden's autofill detects a different URI from the saved vault item, and when an iframe is used in the login process. New users who create their accounts on mobile apps, browser extensions, and desktop apps can now check known data breaches for the prospective master password via Have I Been Pwned? Logging in with a device is now available for additional clients. Login requests can also be initiated from browser extensions, mobile apps, and desktop apps. And starting later this month, the Bitwarden application will begin alerting users if their KDF iterations are lower than the recommended default of 600,000 for PBK DF2. Argon 2 ID is also an optional alternative KDF for users seeking specialized protection. A stronger master password has a higher impact on security than KDF iterations, so you should have a long, strong, and unique master password for the best protection. Share private data securely with coworkers across departments or the entire company with fully customizable and adaptive plans. Bitwarden's Teams organization option is just $3 a month per user, while their enterprise organization plan is just $5 a month per user. Individuals can always use the basic free account for an unlimited number of passwords. Upgrade anytime to a premium account for less than $1 a month, or bring the whole family with their family organization option to give up to 6 users premium features for only $3.33 a month. At TWiT, we're big fans of password managers. Bitwarden is the only open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, on the go, or at work, and is trusted by millions of individuals, teams, and organizations worldwide. Get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or get started for free across all devices as an individual user at bitwarden.com/twit. That's bitwarden.com/twit. And we're back. So, Mike, you went down to see Starship launch.
I did. I went down to see it launch, but I did not end up seeing it launch.
Yeah.
I was down for the Monday attempt, which got within about 9 minutes, I think, before it got scrubbed with that valve issue. And then I actually had to come home for like various other life commitments. But yeah, I saw the lead up. I saw the incredible atmosphere down there. There are hundreds and hundreds of people on the beach and down on South Padre Island, which is just across this little strait from Boca Chica where they were launching. And yeah, it was really interesting. It was like a party. I mean, I was thinking, it felt like what some of the Apollo launches must have felt like, I mean, just how excited everybody was. And there's a giant rocket on the pad and you're not sure if it's going to lift off or if it's going to make it and all that sort of thing. It was a really incredible atmosphere. So yeah, I was definitely glad to have gone down there to kind of experience that firsthand.
Now, Boca Chica isn't exactly Miami Beach or Titusville, which have rows and rows of hotels on the beach and things to do and places to stay and all that. This is an area that kind of sprung out of relative obscurity when Elon Musk decided to put Starbase down there. What was that setting like? I mean, where the heck did you stay, for instance?
Yeah, I stayed in Brownsville, which is not that far away. It's about like a 45-minute drive, I guess. But you could also, you could come from the other direction and go and stay on like South Padre Island, which is pretty built up. It's pretty touristy. It's got nice beaches, nice sandy beaches and stuff like that. So there is infrastructure like around there, but actual Boca Chica itself, that beach itself is a little isolated. It's a wildlife preserve, or they've kind of carved it out right next to a wildlife preserve. But it is like a public beach, and that's been a focus of some like debate and some discussion from the local community about it's a public beach, but they keep getting pushed out of it for tests and all that stuff. So it is pretty complicated. But I guess anytime you build a gigantic Mars rocket and launch it, it's going to be complicated because it's going to create a lot of mess and a lot of noise, which we can also talk about, I guess.
Yeah.
We saw some of that during the launch yesterday.
Well, and we're going to see a few minutes of recording from our good friend Tarek. But before we do, I just want to set the stage. So in case anybody's been living in a cave or prison cell for the last couple of years, well, prison cells have news. This is the first complete test of the Starship system. So we've seen Starship itself fly a couple of times successfully, more or less successfully, but that's just the top stage. When you add the Super Heavy booster to the bottom, you get a rocket that's 390 feet tall, which is a little under 30 feet taller than the Saturn V. And it's got 33 engines on the bottom and then 6 engines on the top stage. Starship itself is 160 feet tall and has a payload volume of 35,000 cubic feet, which makes it larger pressurized volume than the ISS, at least as of the last set of data we got.
Yeah.
The top stage is covered with silica tiles, not unlike what was used in the shuttle, but they're a little more standardized. They're little hexagonal things. Some of them are curved, some are flat, but made for much more rapid and inexpensive recovering of that surface. So this test was supposed to be about 90 minutes, and it would be suborbital, but close enough so that they could get a good idea what they were doing. So what was supposed to happen is it was supposed to launch, which would be the first actual launch test of the bottom stage, which is a big deal because nobody's ever successfully flown anything with 33 engines on it. Mm-hmm. It was supposed to stage. Starship would continue boosting up into this near orbital trajectory. The first stage, Super Heavy, would come down in the Gulf of Mexico, which it did, although it was supposed to come down in one piece, not many. And then Starship would continue on to just off the coast of Hawaii and come down, hopefully make a soft landing on the water there. So before we continue, why don't we go ahead and roll our recording from Tarek and hear what he heard, and for those of you watching video, see what he saw.
After an issue on the booster that the team is working on, but it sounds like they've cleared it, and we're waiting. They're going to start at T-minus 40 seconds, and then count down to liftoff. There it is! Oh! Are you going, or are you stuck? Whoa! Whoa! There it is! Oh my God!
Some creative language there from the audience, not Tarek. So it's interesting that sounds a lot more like a Saturn V launch than a shuttle launch. A shuttle launch was a very low, boomy thing. But with this, like the Saturn V, you get that kind of high-pitched crackling noise after a while. And we're seeing a little bit more of it here. And it looked like it was going well. There are a few flashes coming out of the engines, which is always disturbing because you're afraid those might be parts of turbine blades or nozzle material or something. But as we could see from the video that they were tracking it, there at first a couple of engines out, and then by the time it was supposed to stage, depending on who you talk to, either 5 or 6 of the engines out of 33 were not running. I guess one stopped and restarted, which is pretty remarkable in itself. That's an engine test right there. And then unfortunately, when it got up to, I think it was 24 miles, at about 4 minutes, it was still boosting, which is a little longer than we thought it was supposed to boost, although you're never quite sure because it can be tough getting your information out of SpaceX sometimes, at least in a timely fashion. But it kept boosting, and then at the point that it was supposed to stage, it was still connected, and then it began a slow tumble. And those of us watching it, at least here on TV at home, I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if, I knew it was supposed to do kind of a pitch over maneuver prior to firing to come back, but I didn't think it was supposed to do that well. It was still connected. It was supposed, there are like a bunch of things. There are 3 main things that were supposed to happen about 2 minutes, 50 seconds after launch. You were supposed to get first engine shutdown, then you were supposed to get stage separation, and then you were supposed to get like upper stage engine startup, all within like a 10-second span right around then. And we'll learn more from SpaceX when they put out a more definitive kind of account of what happened, but we could see that we didn't get stage separation, and it really looked like we didn't get first stage shutdown either, at least not totally, because you could see flame coming out of Super Heavy all the way up pretty much until the end. And like the end came with the automatic with the flight termination system. SpaceX commanded it at just under 4 minutes because it was obvious that it wasn't gonna make it. So they like put an end to the flight, and they blew up both of the vehicles, both Super Heavy and Starship, out over the Gulf. Like we can speculate about it. I mean, it's unclear exactly what caused those problems, but we know those were problems. SpaceX said they had multiple engine outs. It was they said there were 5 of them, I believe, or at least that's based on their kind of like in orbit, the like kind of diagram that they had of the Raptors during the webcast. It showed like 5 of them out toward the end of the flight, and we don't know why they suffered those outs, or we don't know why we didn't get stage separation or shutdown of first stage, if that's indeed what happened as it seemed. So can speculate about it, but we'll just have to wait to hear more from SpaceX about the sort of proximate causes of those issues. It's interesting because up now we have the SpaceX recording of the rocket, and we're seeing these pulsing flashes coming out of the first stage. And, maybe that's something that's endemic to the Raptors. I've never seen it before. The only time I've seen it is when engines were setting up to fail. And yet, as far as we could tell, and as far as anybody said, there were no explosive failures of anything, just multiple shutdowns, which is what you want an engine to do if things aren't going well. At least on this rocket. I mean, if you lost an engine on the Saturn V, that was 1/5 of your total thrust gone, and that was a very bad day, although it did happen once or twice, and they managed to just throttle the other ones longer to get to orbit. You'd think with 33, if you lose 3 or 4 or 5, again, you just throttle the rest of them a little longer to get where you want to go once the system's operational. And I think it's worth mentioning, you and I both watch the traditional press as they respond to these things. I did a bunch of radio yesterday. You probably did some as well, answering people's questions about this. And there's, this pernicious, continuing sort of drive towards, Elon blows up another rocket, it's a failure.
Yeah.
And, it takes a lot of breath to explain, look, this is kind of part of the plan. Yeah. And he was being very careful to hedge his bets up front and say, look, we clear the launch tower, I'll be a happy camper. I'm paraphrasing. But, again, this is a test of the first stage, never been flown before. It's extremely complicated. The only other time this, even close to this number of rockets on any stage were flown. It was by the Soviet Union back in the 70s. They tried it 4 times. They all ended explosively.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've seen Starship land a couple of times, but in a sense, that's almost simpler than what they're trying to do today. So can you contextualize a little bit why this isn't a failure?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And some of he just blew up another rocket, Elon stuff. I mean, some of that stems from people being upset with him about other things, about the sort of direction he's sort of taken Twitter. And it's complicated, right? I mean, Elon's relationship with the press is pretty complicated for various reasons. But yeah, just in terms of this test, though, it's also important to note first off that this is a new engine. I mean, Raptor is not the same engine that flies in the Falcon 9 or the Falcon Heavy. It's designed to be more powerful and also to be kind of Mars ready. It burns liquid oxygen, liquid methane, which Elon has said repeatedly. You can source it on Mars. It's more ready to help us explore Mars. So we've seen Raptors fly before, as you were mentioning, on those kind of high altitude test flights of the upper stage, but we saw a maximum of 3 of them fly together on those flights. So putting 39 of them on one vehicle and expecting them all to work together perfectly the first time is really asking too much, I think. And yeah, I mean, this is how SpaceX operates, though, right? It's very different than the NASA approach. NASA is using taxpayer money. They have a lot of oversight from Congress. They're extremely risk averse because they know if something bad happens and it's going to call in all these people saying, what are you doing? That's a waste of money. You just blew up $1 billion, all that stuff. And, that's the system that they have to operate under. So they have to take a different approach. I mean, SpaceX has always been, we're going to build it and we're going to test it and we're going to learn from whatever happens. And so I personally think this was a pretty big success for them to have gotten 24 miles up and to have not totally destroyed the launch tower. I think that we've seen SpaceX do this before, where they test something that they build and then they come right back. I don't know how soon they're going to be able to come back with the next Starship launch. I mean, because I don't know if people have seen some of the photos that are circulating on Twitter about what those Raptors of the Super Heavy did to the launch mount at Starbase. It looks like it gouged out a pretty big crater under them, but that's all speculation. SpaceX hasn't commented on that officially about what Starbase looks like now after that launch. But just in general, SpaceX's whole system is, we're going to test it fast, we're going to build the next one fast, and we're going to learn from it and fly again fast. So they already have multiple Starships built or in production at Starbase. And so I'm sure that the next one has improvements already built in based on these first ones, which had kind of been in the hangar for a while. These vehicles that flew yesterday, Booster 7, which was a Super Heavy, and Ship 24, the upper stage, are kind of like a previous generation based on, and so what's going to fly next are going to be newer vehicles with more bells and whistles on them, more improvements. And that's the process. It's all iterative. So there will be incremental improvements on each flight. I mean, maybe the next one will fail too, and maybe the next one after that. But SpaceX always takes the longer view. They're planning on flying dozens of these things, and they will probably get it at some point, and it's probably going to be before a lot of people expect.
Well, you kind of touched on this, but I think it is important to note, when you're talking about, is it a failure or a success? This rocket was specifically designed to be something that could be built on an assembly line, and they're building them in some quantity. They've got either 2 or 3 more ready to go in a matter of weeks or months. So it's not like the SLS where you've got one very big, very, very expensive, by the end of the flight, over $4 billion rocket ready to go. These things are being built at some scale and much more affordably, and it's not taxpayer money. To your point about NASA being risk averse, I mean, I don't blame NASA. They can't fail because they'll have people crawling all over him, screaming and yelling, "How could you not succeed?" Elon could do it his way, and he does. And there's also a fair amount of back and forth in the Twitterverse and elsewhere about, you've orchestrated your engineers at Hawthorne to cheer even after it fell. Why are they cheering after it blew up? And, if I'm an engineer and I built this thing, especially if I was working on the Super Heavy as opposed to the upper stage, I'd be cheering too. I think there is a little bit of creative direction that goes on there. I've been to a couple of press conferences there where you probably have too at Hawthorne, where they put the media in this little tiny corral above this crowd of heads that you can't avoid having in the foreground of your shot.
Yeah.
And there's Elon and the team in the background doing whatever they do. But that said, we heard that crowd around Tarek, and they were doing the same thing. They were going bonkers because people are excited about this. And there's a lot of reasons to be excited about it because it's an incredible big picture. So speaking of which, I do want to talk about FAA licensing, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what the big picture is for this, the history of Starship.
Well, yeah, what the ultimate goal is, I mean, he's said many times, Elon has said repeatedly that he founded SpaceX about 20 years ago now with the express purpose of like helping humanity colonize Mars, help us become multiplanetary. We've all heard him say that many, many times now. And this vehicle is the one that he's been building toward, or what he's relying on to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, this is his and SpaceX's long-term vehicle of the future, sort of. What they intend to do with Starship is pretty much everything. He has said that eventually, when it's mature enough, he wants Starship to be doing pretty much everything that SpaceX does now and more. I mean, it's the vehicle that will launch their kind of next generation Starlink satellites, which will be bigger and more powerful than the ones that have like mostly been going up now. It'll be a crew vehicle. It'll be a point-to-point transportation here on Earth vehicle. It'll take NASA astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface. They already have like a NASA contract to do that, starting with Artemis 3 in 2025, although that's an ambitious timeline. So, I mean, and they're private customers. He's booked 3 private Starship missions, from private customers. 2 of them are going to go around the moon, like with private customers on board. We don't know when those are going to happen. That depends on the developmental timeline. And then all that stuff is leading up toward going to Mars. And that's what he really wants to do with Starship. So once it becomes mature and, we don't know when that timeline is going to be. We don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know if it's actually going to happen. This is still a complicated vehicle. We can look at the track record SpaceX has, which is extremely impressive, but you still can't assume that this is going to work just the way he wants it to. But if it does, or in some approximation of that grand vision, then it is going to be revolutionary. And if this thing is able to loft 165 tons of cargo to low Earth orbit, or mass, whatever you want to put on it, and it can fly for a few $1,000,000 a flight, which is incredibly ambitious, but maybe it's 10 times. Maybe it's 20 million or 30 million or even 100 million. Even that would be revolutionary, right? That will enable us to do all sorts of things. We could conceivably get a Mars outpost up and going in a couple dozen flights or something, and then if it's that capable, then we could also launch science missions to like the ocean moons of the outer solar system, right? We could do all sorts of stuff with this thing. We can put anything on it, and if it's cheap enough and dependable enough, it can go anywhere. So, I mean, that's why all those people on the beach on South Padre Island are so excited. I mean, some of them are excited because they're kind of SpaceX fanboys. There are definitely those people out there, right? But some of them are space enthusiasts, and they see the promise of this thing, and they see the excitement that is just inherent in having big dreams. A lot of the people that you talk to from the Apollo generation, they talk about how excited they are now because NASA's going back to the moon with Artemis, but also because of Starship, because they would say this is what spaceflight is supposed to be. It's supposed to be bold, and it's supposed to be extremely ambitious. And, it's not a knock against the shuttle or the International Space Station, which are doing which did exciting things in the shuttle's case. In the space station's case, they're doing important work to prepare for those longer journeys to the moon and Mars. But it's those longer journeys that get people excited. And a lot of people are just happy that there actually are plans now to try to make that happen.
All right. Well, I've got a question about the FAA, which I'm going to ask you in just a second after we take this short break. So part of the reason it took this long to see this test launch was getting their launch license from the FAA, which I think by the time they were done, it took almost 18 months, didn't it?
Yeah, it was more than 500 days. The FAA held a press call a week or so ago, and they said it was well over. Yeah, it was well over 500 days. It was like one of their longest reviews ever, basically.
So what was the snag? I mean, I know there are multiple points of friction. Part of it was about, is this safe to fly? Part of it was about environmental concerns. Part of it was issues with the community there in Boca Chica, which was kind of a sleepy little, not much going on before Starbase got there. So what was the cumulative set of issues they were looking at?
I think it's a combination of all those things. The fact that it is the most powerful rocket ever built, and they needed to build all the stuff on site to make that happen. And it is like it's a biologically sensitive area. It's this really nice wetland place down. I was there. It is really nice. I mean, and it is sensitive. Wetlands are being degraded at an incredible rate here and all over our world. And this is it like abuts up against like a national wildlife refuge, and there's various things that you have to do, boxes you have to check if your activities are going to have an impact in those areas. One of the things SpaceX had to do, they had to perform more than 75 kind of mitigative actions to make sure that all the stuff they were doing at Starbase to make this like orbital flight come off, they had to take 75 actions that would kind of minimize the impact on the surrounding environment. And some of this stuff too, some of the cause for the delay was a lot of the people or some of the people in the area did protest, and some of it was coordinated by people outside of the South Texas area who didn't agree with it and were concerned about the wildlife impacts and wrote like kind of letter writing campaigns and stuff like that. But there actually was some local opposition to some of these plans too, and they filed forms and paperwork, and those have to be addressed. And it's just it's a bureaucracy. You have to check those boxes to get these things done. And this was a complicated project in a sensitive area, and it took a long time for those boxes to get checked. So we'll see.
Well, and I guess, part of what you do when you're trying to adjudicate this kind of review is look at prior cases. But I'm not sure there's a prior case of any private organization trying to do anything vaguely like this, unless you're talking about strip mining or something, because we've never had a billionaire launching his own rockets before. We've never had a private entity launching their own rockets on this kind of scale or scope, at any rate.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Werner von Braun back in I guess it was the late 40s, early 50s by the time it was in English. You probably read the Mars Project. I mean, he was talking about, building an armada of crewed spacecraft to go to Mars. And to do that, we'd have, I think, 940 flights of his hydrazine-fueled shuttle, which was a kind of a dart-shaped winged thing. And it's a long story, but the part I'm getting to is they were going to launch from either Johnston Atoll or Christmas Island off in the Central Pacific. And I haven't been to Christmas, but I've been to Johnston Atoll, and it literally looks like a semi-truck parking lot in the middle of a couple thousand miles of ocean. It's about big enough to be a landing strip. And there are no critters there, at least not now. There was only a couple of palm trees. The only thing that was there was a shed. So we landed there to refuel on a flight that I was going onward on. There's a shed where they burn biohazard materials or biological weapon test materials. That's what it was.
Wow.
And it wasn't smoking that day, thank God. But my point here is, he was going to build this launch infrastructure there. Of course, they'd have to have freighters and freighters of all these corrosive fuels and all that. But the idea was it wouldn't bother anybody or anything. Environmentalism wasn't then what it is today, obviously, but there just wasn't a whole lot. You might splash something downrange that would create a plume of toxic chemicals in the ocean and wipe out some jellyfish, but that was kind of the extent of it. And I have often wondered, as difficult as that would be in terms of logistics, and it would be because you'd have to ship all your fuels down there and so forth, but how much easier that would be, especially because you're going to a different jurisdiction in terms of political ownership, where you could say, hey, do you mind if we spill a couple 100 gallons of liquid oxygen right here? And they're like, yeah, go ahead, just pay us,
Yeah. No, that is a viable option. We actually might see some of that from people who don't want to go through all of this paperwork and say, oh, I'll just launch from international waters and make sure I'm not anywhere near a marine sanctuary, and I'll just launch my rockets and nobody's going to stop me. I mean, maybe we will see that from another launch company coming down the road. I mean, it's just interesting too, because like the whole launch licensing regime is basically, it's geared toward a period of time that we're no longer in. We moved into an era of really rapid launch, and we're only going to get more launches as time goes on. So there have been various calls from a bunch of different launch companies, which is no surprise, to try to streamline the whole licensing process. And they say it's ossified and it's built for a different era, which it kind of is. I mean, if we really want to become a spacefaring or like a spacefaring society, then we need to have it just be easier to get these ambitious projects up and off the ground. That's a viewpoint. They're coming from a perspective that obviously that change would like benefit them. So take that with a grain of salt, but it's sort of, I mean, you can see where the rationale is in that, because we are flying many, many more times than we used to fly, like every year. SpaceX has said they could launch 100 times this year, and China's going to launch at least 60 times this year. So can we afford, do we have the bureaucratic infrastructure to scrutinize every individual launch to the degree that we are now? I mean, maybe we do, or like maybe we need to change things up is what some people say. But I mean, I'm not coming down on either side of this. I think it's important to do these sorts of reviews to make sure you're not going to pollute the environment or put people in harm's way. So it's an ongoing debate. It's like safe to say that people are having these discussions about what the best path forward is.
But there's got to be, I would think, another level of tension, which is you have the FAA on one side, which is still, and perhaps it's a little out of date the way they're doing it, but still charged with regulating this kind of thing, along with the EPA and others. But you also have, on the other side, NASA needing this rocket to succeed pretty soon, because they're going to be using it for a lunar lander for Artemis 3, which is supposed to happen in 2 years. We'll see. And they have other things they'd like to do with Starship. And of course, a spaceship is talking about the Space Command is talking about using Starship. I think a Space Command or the Army, I forget which, as a point-to-point cargo delivery system. Yeah. And I don't know, are they even talking about delivering troops, possibly point-to-point?
I don't think they've publicly said troops yet, point to point, but they've talked about cargo. And like, I mean, you would think if the cargo works, then troops wouldn't be far behind, right? I mean, yeah. So all this stuff, those are possibilities if Starship does what it is theoretically capable of. All of these use cases are going to come into play.
And then, of course, you have a large percentage of Congress and a whole bunch of the military in the United States very concerned about the quote unquote China threat in space, which is a real thing, and really wanting this to succeed, because if it does, I don't know, it's hard to say, but somewhere between 5 years and a decade ahead of anybody else in terms of large scale deliveries to orbit and the moon. So do you have any sense of how that kind of friction plays out within government between a regulatory organization and all the other political forces that are tugging on them?
I don't really have personal any real insights on that, but I do know that the FAA, or I strongly suspect that they feel pressured in certain ways. Just look at what they just kind of pressure, SpaceX was putting on the FAA in the lead up to this launch. I mean, Elon tweeted kind of repeatedly, "We're all ready to go. We're just waiting on a launch license." And that's like soft pressure. It's not like he's threatening. I mean, he's not threatening them or anything, but it is like he's got 130 million Twitter followers. He's the richest person in the world. And he's like, "Okay, FAA, come on. So there is pressure being put on them in various ways. And, I think it's very admirable that they feel like they aren't going to bow to that, and they're going to do their job, and they're going to issue their sort of licensing when it's ready, and they're going to do it to the best of their ability. I think that's great, but I suspect that they do feel pressure to get these things kind of streamlined, because I mean, this is national security too. If you're talking about, I mean, we have a lot of space assets. Space is a huge domain for the military, and it's getting bigger every day. So I'm sure it's a difficult spot for them to be in, and because their chief task is to safeguard it's to safeguard the American public, right? That's their main task, is to make sure these launches don't hurt people, threaten people, and then kind of like down the line from there, harm the environment, which could end up harming people if you're talking about getting a bunch of pollution in our waterways and stuff like that. So it's a tough spot for them to be in. And I don't have any personal insight into it, but just having followed the whole Boca Chica saga a little bit about the kind of construction of Starbase and the licensing process for this first orbital kind of velocity launch, yeah, it's been fraught. There's been a lot of kind of back and forth, and it's a very complicated thing for them to deal with.
Well, and as we know, and you kind of touch on this, Elon Musk is not above exerting some pressure of his own. I remember probably 7 years ago now when he wanted to get in on the Air Force launch contract business, which was locked down by United Launch Alliance at that point. And he tried to bid the Air Force, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically kind of looked at this kid sticking his nose under the tent and said, "Nice try, Junior. Come back when you got a real rocket," which he already had at that point.
Yeah.
And so, what do you do with a client that's being a little resistant to letting you bid? Well, in his case, he sued him. Which is, I thought, wow, that's kind of a bold move, but it worked. and he's done some of those kinds of things repeatedly since then. Seems to serve him well. And you just can't argue with somebody who basically at this point controls, I think, about half the global launch market, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's not, I mean, his kind of exerting soft pressure is not inconsequential. And it's not just because he's rich and because he's very effectively trolling people on Twitter. It's also because I mean, his company, SpaceX, is like vital to national security. They do launch a lot of our space assets, and they've increasingly launched. I mean, they launch GPS satellites. They launch a bunch of stuff for the Space Force now, and they're only going to get more important as time goes on. And it is very complicated because he is. I mean, it's one of the most important companies in the world, SpaceX, for a variety of reasons, and I'm pretty sure that the U.S. military feels that same way.
Okay, so I'm winding up for the big haymaker question here, the big haymaker pitch. So we've tested a few Starships. As far as we know, they were pretty much just an empty fuselage. Assuming that within the next couple of tests of Starship and Super Heavy succeed, you've now been able to send this basically empty prototype up into orbit. That's good. There's a lot of steps between that and where they want to go with Starship. So they've got to add life support systems, just even to operate in low Earth orbit with people. Then you've got the tanker issue. They have to be able to refuel it once it's in orbit with additional flights to deliver full cargo loads to the moon. We've got the lunar version that they got to build for NASA to land on the moon. And we've got plans beyond that, which will require additional radiation hardening and all that. So can you kind of sketch out, to your awareness anyway, what the future footprint and tracking of all this will look like? I realize that's a pretty big. It
is. I mean, I remember back when like Elon first introduced the Starship concept. It was first called like the Interplanetary Transport System, and then it was the BFR, and it finally shifted to become Starship. I remember like a lot of reporters were asking, because he would show these slide decks with Starship going to Mars with all these passengers on board, and he had these grand dreams of there being all these like restaurants on Starship, and people were talking about, well, that seems kind of hard to do. Like, how are you going to do the life support and support all these people? And he just sort of waved it away as like, oh, it's pretty easy to do life support. We can do that with Dragon pretty easily. And it's like, it's not going to be that easy though for a ship that big. And I mean, it is more complicated to just go from an empty shell, kind of like you're talking about, to make it a full-fledged spaceship that can support like a dozen people or more, which is
he was saying 80 at one point for a 5 to 7 month journey to Mars.
I don't
that big of space.
I don't think that's in the cards anymore. I mean, some of these crew missions that are going on Starship, the Dear Moon mission that is going to be one of the round the moon flights, private flights. It's going with, I think, with 9 people, 8 or 9. So that might be more the short term. I mean, maybe it's a big space. It can probably hold more than that, but probably not in the hundreds, right? So, but all this stuff, I mean, spaceflight is very complicated. All these things for crew missions, especially, just have to get tested and tested and tested and tested, like before you're ready to put people on board, right? So, like, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, and you could go broke betting against SpaceX, but they like do tend to publicize very ambitious timelines. I would be surprised if Starship's ready to carry people to the moon by 2025. Like, I don't know when their next flight's going to be, right? Of next test flight. It's just so hard to tell. But Elon and SpaceX are extremely accomplished. They've done a lot, and they do work fast. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen. Just in general, with space in general, you kind of have to take a lot of these timelines with a grain of salt, because it's very difficult, and things usually take longer than you think they're going to take, like especially when you're talking about astronaut missions.
So here's a slightly more detailed question, then I'll step back to the big picture. So we've got the Artemis 3 mission plan. So in a few years, give or take, we're going to launch 4 American astronauts on the SLS in the Orion capsule. Mm-hmm. They're going to leave low Earth orbit with their upper stage and rocket out to the moon and rendezvous, I guess, directly with the lunar Starship, which will be in orbit, because we're really not sure yet where the gateway is going to be anywhere in that timeline, right?
Yeah.
So you transfer, I believe, 2 of those astronauts, is that right? Are going down? No, 3 are going to lunar surface, right?
I think so. Although all this it's still notional, right? It could change. Yeah.
So you transfer a couple of those people from that tiny Orion capsule to this enormous semi-truck sized landing vehicle. And they're going to be sitting up presumably in the nose of that. Basically, I'm sure it'll be mostly a computer controlled landing, but you're kind of looking over your shoulder at the lunar surface, which is now very far away because you're 100 something feet up in the air. Have they got plans, at least for those first couple Artemis missions, to carry anything in that enormous cargo volume?
I would strongly suspect that they would, right? NASA would. I'm sure they'll put scientific instruments on board, and it's huge. Obviously, we were just talking about how much. You could put a habitat
and a rover in there, yeah.
Yeah, I would bet that they're going to put they're going to fill up that space to the extent that is safe and feasible. I'm sure, because NASA, as we're saying, they don't have a ton of money, and so they want to maximize every chance they get to put stuff on the moon. Deliver scientific equipment to the moon, or an outpost, or a rover, and anything that they can. I'm sure that's like ready to safely fly on those Starship missions. They will try to fly. It would be a big waste just to go down with an empty Starship with like 2 or 3 people on board. Just all that empty space. I don't see that happening.
If I was rich enough, I'd just commission a bunch of blocks of lead to stick in there just to show that I could. Before I let you go, this is a slight sideways step, but I haven't heard or read much about Gateway lately. There was a brief mention about 2 weeks ago about a new contract being let or something, but it's gotten pretty quiet. What do you know?
I don't know. I haven't heard much about Gateway either. Everything's always changeable and in flux. Like I think they like said Gateway was not on the sort of critical path for the Artemis 3 mission, right? Which is what you were just talking about. Like which means we don't have to have Gateway up and running. And for people who don't know, Gateway is the small moon orbiting space station that they're going to build. NASA's going to build as part of the Artemis program. But yeah, it's not on the critical path for Artemis 3, so they don't have to have it up and running by the time Artemis 3 launches. But after that, I think it's still officially in NASA's plans with the first launch of like Gateway hardware in the 2024 timeframe. So I think they do still plan to build it, although there are voices of dissent in the space community about do we really need it? If we have Starship that can just go directly down to the surface, why do we need this space station? Why do we need to rendezvous with it? There are people who sort of question why it's in the plan, but it is still in the plan, like for now. And we shall see. It'd be cool to have a moon orbiting space station, but things can always change.
Well, Mike, I would like to thank you very much for joining me today, and tell us about your book.
Oh, it's came out like 4.5 years ago, I guess. It's it's called Out There. It's about the search for alien life and some of the stuff that's been happening in the private space flight kind of revolution too. But it like mostly kind of looks at how we're searching for life and if life is out there somewhere and what might happen if we find it. So,
Well, I hope it's generating enough royalties to buy you a new condo in San Francisco.
Yeah, it would have to be a bestseller for that to be the case. So,
yeah, don't I know it? Well, but congratulations on getting it done. Getting a book published these days by a major publisher is no small feat. And of course, we can always track your other activities at space.com, where you are a prolific contributor.
Oh, well, no, and it's always exciting, and there's more to write about now than there ever has been before, and that's only going to continue. It's busy.
Kind of nice to be holding off a fire hose of news as opposed to 10 or 15 years ago, and it's kind of like, oh, God, do I have anything to put up today?
Yeah, it's pretty funny. You know, Tarek talks about when he covered the space shuttle missions, like, I don't know, 15 or so years ago. And he would just go down to Florida and be there for like 2 weeks and just like covering every aspect of the mission. It's just like, oh,
they had another hydrogen leak today.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, that too. And like, now they're asleep and this is the wake up song.
Right.
And this is what they're eating. And it's like, I mean, it's kind of charming and quaint to think about that as the space beat back in the day, because now there's just so much happening. You really have to prioritize. It's like triage. There's so many things happening, not just there's SpaceX and there's China and there's all these other space nations. India's got to launch early tomorrow morning. There's just all this stuff happening. And it's great. It's great that there is so much happening, but it can be a challenge to stay on top of it all.
Well, all I can say is, as a survivor of the first space age, I'm very thrilled to see this one finally bearing the fruit that we had all hoped for and frankly expected. And of course, you can always find me at pylebooks.com or at astromagazine.com, where I'm editor-in-chief. Don't forget to drop us a line if you wish at twis@twit.tv. That's TWIS at twit.tv. We always welcome your comments, suggestions, ideas, and jokes. Don't forget. And don't forget to check out space.com. The website's in the name, where all good space things are and happen. And the National Space Society at nss.org. These are both good places to satisfy your spaceflight cravings. And go SpaceX! New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher. So make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and give us reviews. We'll take 5 stars or a thumbs up or a wink of an eye or whatever's appropriate for that platform. You can also head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. Finally, don't forget, you can get all the great programming on the TWiT network ad-free on Club TWiT. I'm a member. You should be too. There's some extras available there that are only available there, and it's all yours for just $7 a month. That's the best bargain you're going to find all year. You can also follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. Thank you very much, and I'll bring my lazy tongue back next week. See you then.
Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here. In case you hadn't heard, Home Theater Geeks is back. Each week, I bring you the latest audio-video news, tips and tricks to get the most out of your AV system, product reviews, and more. You can enjoy Home Theater Geeks only if you're a member of Club TWiT, which costs $7 a month, or you can subscribe to Home Theater Geeks by itself for only $2.99 a month. I hope you'll join me for a weekly dose of home theater geekitude.